Today is the 10th of November, 2015, and we're talking about Reagan's negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev from October 1986 to his retirement. And it even goes beyond his retirement because there were two disarmament treaties signed. And the last one, the IBM Treaty, was signed in 1991. It was negotiated during Reagan's term, but it was actually signed by his successor, George Bush 41, the second Bush, George Bush 43 signed it. 41, the early Bush, yeah. 1991. And the importance of these two treaties, called the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Forces Agreement, were both negotiated in the last 2 years of the Reagan administration, 1987-88. And they were still on the books when he was forced to retire through the end of his term. My guest is Dave DeWitt, who is Athens News correspondent, and I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University, and this is the Athens Speakout, number 352. Dave DeWitt is going to ask me questions since I am the expert on this subject, and he is a substitute partner here because of the jam-up of the services of Jeff Reisner, who had been talking about this problem. But since he got elected, he's busy now with some real serious work in the Athens City Council race. So Dave is going to ask me the first question. What is your understanding about what happened at Reykjavik discussions between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev? And that town in Iceland was located one halfway between Washington and Moscow on the 12th of October, 1986. And this was their third meeting. Reagan had met Gorbachev twice before for just a get-together talk and two human beings talking to one another. But in Reykjavik, they actually got down to the business of nuclear disarmament.
So here's my question.
Yes.
I have been to Reykjavik, incidentally.
You have?
Well,
you're ahead of me.
Just very briefly, flying through on my way to Austria.
Yeah.
But my question is, as I understand it, Gorbachev wanted to limit the talks in Reykjavik to arms control, and Reagan wanted to expand the talks to include a variety of other things.
What is your source for this?
I've just read this on my research online, reading about the Reykjavik summit. It said that Reagan wanted to include discussion of human rights, immigration of Soviet Jews and dissidents.
True. That is true.
And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan,
yeah,
in addition to the arms control talks.
Yeah. Reagan wanted to talk about everything across the board. Mm-hmm. Now, Reagan was still threatening Gorbachev with SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, this idea of laser beams, being able to, X-rays, be able to knock down an incoming ICBM before it ever hit the thing. Now this
the Star Wars
part. Yeah, well, this was a pie-in-the-sky plan of Edward Teller. And the experiment was never completed. But the Americans were threatening Gorbachev with this SDI. So
They wanted-
Gorbachev wanted the negotiations.
because the Americans made him believe that we were close to making this possible.
Well, the problem is that the United States was way, way ahead of the Soviet Union in technology.
Uh-huh.
And Gorbachev knew that the Soviet Union was collapsing from within.
Right.
There was no end to the Cold War. There was an implosion in Moscow. And Gorbachev was a fresh face. He was a young man. And there had been old guys who were stale Stalin bureaucrats who didn't want to negotiate anything. They were afraid the Soviet Union was collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
So the Soviet Union was being threatened by the satellite states, Poland, East Germany. They all wanted their freedom. They were being threatened by Japanese technology. They were being threatened by the Chinese. They were being threatened by the American technology. So Gorbachev had to have negotiations. He couldn't keep up with the arms race. And he was afraid of SDI. So it was the personal meeting between two human beings that led to this sudden change from an arms limitation treaty, which was the old program, SALT I, SALT II. And Carter didn't get SALT II ratified. So Carter was a failure. And Reagan was, when he first came in 1980, threatened to end the Cold War. Well, I was afraid of Reagan. I thought Reagan was crazy. And so did most of the physicists in Berkeley, Ohio University, all over. They said, this will never work. This is a pipe dream.
Sure.
But Reagan pretended, and the Reagan administration pretended it was going to work. And he was supposedly going to get concessions from Gorbachev. So Gorbachev wanted some kind of a deal, no question about that. But he didn't want to talk about the Jewish release, and he didn't want to talk about, what was that other issue?
The Afghanistan and
well,
human rights.
Afghanistan, he got out. He got out in 1986. The Soviets got out of Afghanistan.
I see.
That was a civil war. So the Soviets decided Afghanistan is a loser. And it was the Carter administration under Zbigniew Brzezinski,
which we've talked about.
and they kept escalating the American participation on this in order to fight the Soviets.
And they wanted to pull
Yeah.
the Soviets into a quagmire and
well,
succeeded in doing so.
This was a civil war that neither the United States or the Soviets could ever win, and they still can't win. So anyway.
Oh, Afghanistan, yeah.
That was not on the table.
It's a silly place to get involved
that was not on the
militarily.
table. There was nothing to say about that. So there were no negotiations in Reykjavik about Afghanistan. But the Americans welcomed the news that the Soviets voluntarily were getting out.
So with regard to this missile defense system,
Yeah.
was Reagan bluffing?
Well,
Was he
that's the
bluffing
big,
Gorbachev
well,
into
no,
a deal?
That is the big mystery. It's clear that in 1982, 1983, Reagan thought that he would have SDI. But this was based on the faith that SDI would work.
And that's 3 or 4 years. That's 4 years earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Now, in 1983, there was a war scare. We talked about that last time with
Right.
Jeff.
Yeah.
And the Soviets thought that Reagan wasn't kidding and that there was going to be an all-out alert. And they had NATO exercises in which the Soviets called out all of their vessels, and they were waiting for Ronald Reagan to press the button, okay? So they had a real war scare. Well, Reagan didn't want this war scare. This was just a routine NATO exercise done in Brussels, and Reagan wasn't paying any attention to this. And then they got the report back, went back to Weinberger, and said, hey, the Soviets are afraid of this. So Reagan said, okay, let's talk to Gorbachev. So Reagan wanted to talk to Gorbachev, but he wanted to limit this to the problem of START. They were talking about START now, they want to have two treaties, the INF, the Intermediate Forces Agreement, in which both sides would take out medium-sized, intermediate-range missiles out of Britain and France, Poland, East Germany. And that was one kind of an agreement which was easier to negotiate. And then there were the ICBMs, in which the Soviet Union and the United States would both destroy weapons on the ground. This is actually destruction of weapons already in existence. This was not limitation.
ICBM being intercontinental ballistic
right.
missiles.
And this is called START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Okay? So when they got to Reykjavik, they didn't sign anything. But Reagan and Gorbachev had a very friendly meeting, and Reagan says, I hope we abolish all of these in 20 years. Well, Gorbachev doesn't reject that, but he says, we have to have our nuclear experts get down and count these missiles. How many submarines do we have? How many launchers do we have? I mean, this is going to be a technical treaty. So nothing was signed, but it was agreed at Reykjavik in 1986 that they would meet again next year, 1987. And in 1987, they actually had a treaty which was signed. That's the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, in which the United States took the Pershings and the crews out of Germany and Britain, and the Soviets took out their SS-20s from Poland, and Western Europe and Eastern Europe were now nuclear free in theory. But only the ICBMs remained, and they had to be negotiated with a more detailed treaty, and that finally was signed after Reagan retired by George Bush 41, the successor, in 1991. So there were two important treaties signed, but Reykjavik was a wonderful agreement between two men. We have to stop this nuclear craziness. The question is, all right, but we got to get the nuclear experts on both sides to verify. Trust and verify became the new slogan after Reykjavik. Now, Weinberger was dragging his feet. He didn't particularly want this. But Weinberger resigned in '87. And he had to resign because of the Iran-Contra scandal.
Right.
So he was a kind of a block. Well, that's where we're up to now. Okay. You have any little further questions about this?
No, we can move on from there.
Okay. So at Reykjavik then, this was their third meeting. The first two meetings in Geneva was just, Reagan and Gorbachev just said, well, you're a nice guy. We should try and limit these nuclear weapons. Fine. So anyway, Caspar Weinberger was at the Reykjavik meeting, and he thought that Reagan had let the horse out of the barn by promising too much. But Weinberger could no longer block this, and the documents are unclear of exactly what Weinberger was resisting for. Now, George Shultz went along with Reagan, okay? So Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev then agreed on two peace treaties, but nothing was put on paper yet. That's what happened at Reykjavik. And then what it meant, though, in fact, when Reagan said, well, let's let the Jews go, Gorbachev said, fine, I don't care about the Jews, that's unimportant. So he just let them go, okay? That was no longer a problem. Gorbachev needed an agreement, okay? So the new slogan was trust but verify, and that's what Reagan came back. Now, whether in his own mind he was ready to do this or whether he was bluffing, that's still somewhat mysterious. See, this all came suddenly to the public. See, I thought Ronald Reagan was crazy with Star Wars. But after Reykjavik, people like the television people, the Cold War is over. They were shocked by Reagan saying, we're going to build down, we're going to destroy weapons. This came as to a surprise, you see. So then I had to think, well, maybe Reagan was better than I thought he was. And after Reagan retired, I had to admit that Reagan did more for disarmament than Kennedy or Nixon or Kissinger or any of the previous agreements.
Yeah, sure.
No question about it. This was an amazing breakthrough. So I thought he was a fool, but I couldn't tell the difference between, and nobody else could, between the movie actor and the real Reagan. So what Reagan's motives were, whether he decided that Edward Teller was nuts, that they would never come up with the SDI,
Right.
or whether Nancy Reagan put pressure on him. But he suddenly discovered he had a religious conscience, and he didn't want to hold this up. Now, what happened between 1983 and 1987 is still somewhat in limbo. But anyway, these treaties were better than Kissinger, better than Kennedy. And now one of the things that I don't think we want to go back to Kissinger and Tricky Dick. That's all past history now, really. Unless you have any questions about that. So, anyway, SDI, strategic arms limitation, never produced any results. The experiments failed. But you see, Ronald Reagan promised, and Gorbachev agreed to the promise. Well, Reagan said to Gorbachev, well, when SDI works, we will inform you of the results. Well, they never had any results,
Well,
so there was
never
nothing to
worked.
inform it.
Sure.
See? So that proved to be an overkill. Anyway, Ronald Reagan. Meanwhile, Teller is in the wastebasket of history. He dies, and he's an unsung hawk who's nobody pays any attention to him now. Anyway, the point is that Gorbachev, for the first time, accepted human rights. He accepted the 1975 Human Rights Declaration. He agreed to let the Jews go, and he said that they would have mutual inspection teams on both sides, and it looked like they would go forward with the INF agreement, which would be signed first. So what explains, I'm going to change the question a little bit, what explains Gorbachev's behavior at Reykjavik? And I think I've already kind of answered that. He was desperate for some kind of an agreement because the American computer business was so far advanced that he couldn't keep up technologically in the arms race. So the INF was negotiated, and the two treaties were tied together. It was just a question of time now. Now, Leonid Brezhnev, on the other hand, was an old man who didn't do anything and was stale. But the important thing about Gorbachev is he was only 52 years old. He was about the same age as I was.
Yeah.
And his mother was a secret Christian all along, see. And Gorbachev first visited London and met with Margaret Thatcher in 1985 and said, I want to open up negotiations. And then Margaret Thatcher said, we can do business with this guy. So Margaret Thatcher encouraged Reagan to rethink this whole thing. Okay, so she's another force because the British don't have the weapons to keep up. They want some kind of a intermediate nuclear forces agreement. So do the French. It's going to leave them free. So anyway, it was Brezhnev who dies in 1984. No, 82. 84. And then Gorbachev comes in 84, right? And the Jackson-Vanik was the treaty that kept the Jews locked up. And Jackson-Vanik was... The United States used to hold up negotiations on Jackson-Vanik. They said, we're not going to negotiate until you let Jews go. And Brezhnev said, we're not going to let Jews go because we educated them. And we don't want them to flee to the West and work against the Soviet Union. So they should stay there because we've educated them, and they should be technological experts for the Soviet Union. Well, Gorbachev says, go. Not necessary. Anyway, now looking at Gorbachev, Gorbachev was 54 years old. He joined the Communist Party in 1952 when he was 21 years old. And he went through the Kremlin hierarchy. And in 1982, he got into the Soviet bureaucracy in the Kremlin. He was recently promoted because the old men were dying and they didn't have anything. But anyway, he became General Secretary in 1985. And the first time he visits Reagan was in 85. And they agree that they need to have some kind of a START or Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Ronald Reagan was living back in the 1930s. He had an idea of Christianity and Christian behavior as it was in 1935, 36. So we've had three great presidents, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and FDR, who were advanced democratic Christians. And Ronald Reagan had some kind of a Christian belief that was similar to Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, not very deep. And the Soviets couldn't tell the difference between propaganda and a sincere Christian, you see. But on Gorbachev's side, Gorbachev made a gesture to Christianity. In 1988, it was the 1,000-year anniversary of Christianity coming to the old Russia. In 988, Vladimir I went down to the Dnieper River, and the tribe of Rus jumped in the river, were baptized, and we have the beginning of the Russian Orthodox Church. So he opens up that Kremlin archive and says, well, my mother was really a Christian, and we're going to celebrate the 1,000th anniversary of Christianity coming to Russia, the old Russia. Mm-hmm. So the old Soviet Union was in decay. It wasn't a question of ending the Cold War. It was Soviet Union was imploding.
Oh, yeah, by the...
From all kinds of pressures. Within Russia, within the satellites, from China, from the missiles. Gorbachev was locked into a time warp, so to speak. And then the Chinese opened up to capitalism in 1976, and even the Chinese were building a capitalist society faster than Russia. So anyway, Ronald Reagan made his last gesture to the arms race in 1983 when he went down to Orlando, Florida, and gave the speech to the ministers. Russia is an evil empire. Right. Well, he admitted to himself that was a flop. He also admitted to himself that going to Bitburg and honoring the SS was a flop. So the important thing about Ronald Reagan is that he was flexible. He didn't have any real deep convictions. He was not a Joe McCarthy. He was not a J. Edgar Hoover. He was a good theologian in that sense, in that he could agree to his own heart, okay? And so anyway, the TV audience was completely fooled by what happened at Reykjavik. And we can go on to another new question, a third question here. We might raise, why did Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev sign the treaty in December of 1987? That was pretty quick. What did they do in that decisive year from Iceland to the signature of that treaty? Well, here we raise another important fact that's not well understood in the United States to this day. Ronald Reagan had a very significant ambassador in Moscow. His name was Jack Matlack. Have you ever heard of him?
No, I haven't heard
Okay.
much of Matlack.
Well, he was in charge of the detailed negotiations. He negotiated with the Soviet nuclear experts on counting the warheads, the submarines, the bombers, the 4 and 5 different sizes of missiles, and so forth and so on. So that the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was ready to sign in 1987 by Matlack's work in Moscow. And then when Reagan came back, he just signed the piece of paper. Okay. Now, Matlack is an important individual thinker of the old free ambassador role, like Franklin Roosevelt or John Quincy Adams, Harry Hopkins, Averell Harriman was the American ambassador to Stalin back under the Roosevelt's day. He had a free hand to negotiate in Moscow the details of this treaty. Now, Matlack was a fan of George F. Kennan, the containment strategy. And Matlack was born in the middle class, Greensboro, North Carolina. He was born in 1929, 2 years older than Gorbachev, 1 year older than myself. We're all of that younger generation who lived through the early Cold War and were a little bit scared by it. So anyway, Matlack went back to Moscow and negotiated from 1986 to 1991, both of these treaties. He was the guy who put down on paper, this is what we have to sign. And Reagan and Gorbachev just quickly signed it. Now, as a young man, Matlack went into the Foreign Service, became a translator in Russian. He knew Russian language. He worked for John F. Kennedy as a translator at the Cuban Missile negotiations in October of 1962. Accidentally, he met Lee Harvey Oswald. He was in Moscow as a lower grade counselor.
Yeah.
When Lee Harvey Oswald comes back and he says, I want a visa to go back to the United States. That seems to be just a coincidence. So Oswald needed the visa and went back to the United States as a private citizen. And in 1972, Matlack, as a personal individual American citizen, campaigned for George McGovern.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting.
And he went back on duty in Moscow for Jimmy Carter in 1974 and started to work on SALT II.
Right, okay.
But that was sabotaged by the CIA and Brezhnev,
Right.
so nothing came of that. But Matlack, on his own terms, wanted an arms agreement and pushed Ronald Reagan along this road, okay? So Matlack then worked on both the INF Treaty and the ICBM Treaty, which was later signed by his successor, George Bush 41. And these were the arms reduction treaties. You have a question?
Take a station break.
All right, we have to stop here. We're talking about Ronald Reagan's quick change of heart from a super hawk to an overnight dove, and was responsible for the negotiations of 2 major disarmament treaties in the last 2 years of his administration. And I'm discussing this with my friend Dave DeWitt of the Athens News, who is probably learning for the first time the importance of Jack Matlack. Now, in 2000, I met Jack Matlack because John Gaddis, one of the most important historians Ohio University ever had, who did a classic biography of George F. Kennan, brought Matlack back here to Ohio University, and I sat in a room with half a dozen graduate students and could talk to Matlack. And I thought Matlack was just great stuff.
Yeah?
He was to the left of John Gaddis. Yeah. I thought that was great. Anyway, Gaddis convinced me that Reagan was a lot smarter than I thought he was. And I had to confess that I was fooled by television propaganda, even though I thought I was a skeptic. So anyway, Matlack went back to Moscow, filled out these details, and facilitated these 2 disarmament treaties. Do you have any further comments or questions about his personality and his success?
Well, I was wondering what he said that so impressed you when you got to meet him.
Well, he spoke just like you and I are speaking, and he said, yes, I spoke to Moscow, and I...
Did he indicate that he took it upon himself to
Well,
get
he
this
didn't get
done?
into the details of
Okay.
what he negotiated. He just said, well, it's now clear that we have 2 treaties, and we now have START. They're a success. So he just filled in what I learned from the media. Well, I learned from the media. Well, I learned that, let's say the Reykjavik meeting was a surprise to me. It was a surprise to me when George Will said the Cold War is over. I thought George Will was a little bit late in saying that, because I thought the Cold War was over long before, because I always thought it was a cliche.
Yeah.
Okay. But I had no idea that they would sign these 2 treaties. And I wasn't counting the number of missiles and so forth. So
Do you think that it had to do with the Reagan administration's coming to a close, the Soviet Union's coming to a close?
Well, Ronald Reagan was flexible, and he was being pressured
Yeah.
by
And
Matlack.
so if this was going to get done, this was the time to do
by
it,
Matlack,
right?
And by the 1983 war scare that the Soviets were mobilizing after he went to Orlando, and he says, well, I got to give up this old-time theology of Cold War propaganda. He dropped that quickly, and he wanted to go out. Now, so Matlack was a pressure on the left, and Gorbachev was a pressure on the left. Margaret Thatcher was a pressure on the left. And of course, all the Democratic Party welcomed Ronald Reagan's quick change. So,
what about the blowback from the right? Was there blowback from the right, or had he already become Saint Reagan in their mind?
The right are totally out of it, because when Ronald Reagan says, we're going to trust but verify, what could the right say in the Senate? We go along with Ronald Reagan. We've put their whole faith in Ronald Reagan.
Right, so he was already Saint Reagan by that point with the right.
Well, he was
Could do
always
no
Saint
wrong.
Reagan. It didn't make any difference what Reagan did.
Yeah.
If he wanted to escalate the war, they would go along. They just thought
He
Ronald
could do
Reagan,
no wrong.
Yeah, he could do no wrong, because the Republican Party hacks are just that.
Yeah.
They stopped thinking after the age 18. Okay. And they thought that Ronald
So
Reagan...
he obviously knew that he could pull them any direction he wanted.
Oh, no,
to
he
go.
had no trouble with the
With the
Republicans.
right, yeah.
The Republicans in the Senate. His only problem was maybe with the CIA, maybe with Weinberger.
But Weinberger had resigned.
He had
But-
resigned, so he's no longer a bloc.
87.
Now, what Ronald Reagan said to Weinberger, why he resigned, that's still in the archives.
We won't know that for 50 years.
Well, who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well,
Schultz
less
is in
than
charge
50
of the
years
State
now.
Department.
20 more years.
Schultz is the boss of Matlack. So he's saying, you go along with Matlack. We've appointed him. Matlack has experience.
So George Shultz had trust in Matlack.
Absolutely. So did Carter. So did Kennedy. There was no suspicion inside the State Department of Matlack. But the average senator doesn't know anything about State
Yeah, they
Department
don't know who
bureaucracy.
this guy is. Yeah.
They were just interested in the military-industrial complex. And I think Weinberger was worried about Bechtel Corporation because they were going to start to lose.
Yeah.
That's why he was holding up.
Yeah.
But that's too late, okay? So in review of Matlack, he gave Gorbachev the personal endorsement, and it went forward. And I think that Ronald Reagan was flexible, and he did have a Christian conference in the long run. And I think that the old slogans of the past were killed by 3 or 4 different forces. And I had given up a long time ago on Walter Lippmann's old cliche of the Cold War, which was only a metaphor. And I think that John Gaddis welcomed Reagan's change of heart, and of course John Gaddis had detailed footnotes on this. So John Gaddis predicted Reagan's success long before I did. I was just a citizen. All I knew was what the television, the New York Times was saying. But John Gaddis was writing this biography of George F. Kennan, and he was looking at every little minor detail of the arms race and the Cold War and containment. Okay, so I read John Gaddis's book, and someday I'll maybe publish a book review of this. But I was a little bit critical of John Gaddis when he was teaching here, because I thought he was a little bit of too close to the State Department. But the State Department is a lot better than the Department of Defense, a lot better than the CIA. So in that sense, we're on the same side. So we'll say he was an establishment Democrat. I was a McGovern Democrat. That's the difference. And he never campaigned for McGovern. But in the long run, McGovern played an important role. Anyway, what about Nancy Reagan?
Yeah, you mentioned her as pulling Ron.
She had a certain influence. She was...
Well, it seemed like she always had a big influence.
Yeah, she had a
on
religious
Ronald.
influence. He was a second wife. Her father was a medical doctor.
Very conservative medical doctor.
Yeah, but she was a loyal Presbyterian, and she had a career in Hollywood, but she didn't go along with the Hollywood hedonist sect of wine, women, and song. And she was always advising Ronald Reagan on get right with religion and God and so forth and so on. And Ronald Reagan was more of a lower class, Seventh-day Adventist, Calvinist type. And Nancy Reagan was more sophisticated as a Presbyterian. And the Presbyterians, Episcopalians, the Roman Catholics were more flexible on religious questions. Anyway, coincidental with this arms deal, in 1984-86, Nancy Reagan opened up a Christian conscience campaign on drugs, and she went around to the youth of America saying, just say no to drugs.
Right, the Just Say No campaign.
Right. And this religious sentiment about drugs and alcohol spilt over to their adopted son, Ron Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ronnie and Nancy had a little quarrel about Ronald Reagan Jr. Ronald Reagan Jr. had an identity crisis, and they were always fighting about drugs and alcohol and so forth and so on. And this became a kind of a family argument. So Ron Reagan, the son, Ron Reagan, confirms Nancy Reagan's religious influence on Ronnie, on the President Reagan. He kind of confirms the importance of Nancy Reagan as a pressure for conscience. That's what it amounts to. So the START Treaty and this argument over the meaning of Christianity was all part of the mix of why both Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev had a spiritual awakening that they had to save the world from nuclear destruction for different reasons. So I think that Nancy Reagan was a force for good. Although that's never been proven. There's too much lacking evidence there. And she wrote her memoirs, her own memoirs. And she kind of...
She doesn't touch on...
Well, she doesn't touch on the
disarmament?
nuclear business, because that wasn't her business. But she talks about Ronald Reagan being flexible, and Ronald Reagan trying to do the right thing according to Christian values, okay? So that's the internal memoirs still to be. So I think I've said about all I want to say about Nancy, unless you have a further comment. Well, I might say this. Ronald Reagan met Gorbachev for the fourth and last time in 1988, after the 1987 treaty was signed, and the IBM treaty was still, the details were still being worked out by Matlack and his Soviet counterpart. They were still counting missiles and warheads and submarines. So I think we're ready for the ICBM treaty called START 1. That was signed on the 31st of July, 1991, and it entered in force in December of 94. And it was called START, a START 2 and START 3 was also negotiated. Ronald Reagan said, we'll reduce the missiles by 50%. Ronald Reagan originally said, I hope that they all can be reduced eliminated in 20 years. Well, they made on the paper, they said, all right, 50% in the next 20 years. So that was kind of limited in that sense by Matlack and his Soviet counterparts. So the SALT 1 and SALT 2 were a success in the long run. Now, in 1991, there were 1,600 ICBMs in existence. And by 2001, 80% of that stockpile on both sides had been destroyed. So they actually went beyond the 50% formula, which they had agreed to in '88. So the total arms race then is that in 1991, the Soviet Union and Gorbachev had 18,306 warheads. And no, that's what Bush had. Bush in the United States had 18,301 warheads, and the Soviet Union had 28,585 warheads. Technically, if you count warheads, they were ahead, but that didn't mean anything because the American missile computer system meant that they could save on actual warheads because they could hit the target more accurately. So that was another myth that the Cold War is.
Well, I think we can agree that either way, it was plenty of nuclear
Yeah, it
warheads
was-
to destroy the world.
Right, right. Now, when Clinton was in office, the Soviets had, the Americans had 10,618 warheads, and the Russians had 10,201, practically parity. And then Gorbachev and George W. Bush got down to 8,000. So the arms race, the destruction, has been continuing. So if we want to go back to the beginning of the whole Cold War, the whole arms race, in 1945, the United States had 6 bombs, Soviet 0. In 1949, the United States had 235, Soviets had 1. The United States was always ahead. In 1968, the United States had 28,000, and the Soviets had 9,000. In 1972, the United States had 27,000, and the Soviets had 14,000. That's at the time of Richard Nixon. In 1980, the Soviets went ahead. When Ronald Reagan first came in, the United States was down to 23,000, and the Soviets were up to 30,000.
Why did the United States begin to lose warheads between 72 and 80? Whose work was
They
that?
didn't
Was
need
that
any
Carter?
more. No, they didn't need any more. They all agreed to overkill.
Yeah.
They all wanted.
So why did they start to reduce? Was that Carter who started to reduce?
Yeah, Carter was reducing it and trying to encourage the Soviets, and so these people, these technologists have stuff in the pipeline. In other words, they put stuff in, we'll say in 1973, which doesn't come online until 74. So, you're not going to change it anyway. Between 72 and 80, between Richard Nixon and 1980, the United States had agreed to reduce its warheads, overkill, from 27,000 to 23,000. And the Soviets were building faster, but they were building obsolete weapons. They were building these big monster weapons that didn't have the accuracy, see?
I see, yeah.
And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan starts talking about Star Wars, and it scared the living daylights out of Gorbachev, and said, well, they'll soon be able to outrun us. But in 88, when it's all over, or when Ronald Reagan's administration is over, the United States was still at 23,000, and the Soviets had gone up to 37,000 warheads. Then in 2002, after the agreements take effect, the United States went down to 10,000, and the Soviets went down to 8,000. They started to go down real fast after they signed the agreements.
Yeah.
It was all obsolete. So the military-industrial complex had already built overkill way back in 1970s, 1967, okay? It was just a question now of convincing the Congress to catch up with reality. So the Cold War of Walter Lippmann is over, and George F. Kennan's Winston Churchill's containment strategy worked by 1991 when the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Well, it looks like we're kind of near the end. Do you have any further questions or comments? Or shall we close this out a little early, or?
Well, I'm curious how we get to the point where we have all the unsecured nuclear weapons in the former Soviet territories that we have today.
You mean who's counting?
Yeah, I mean, we have these agreements where it seemed like we at least had some measure of control back then, and now, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there seems to be a lot of worry in the international community over...
All right, well, the breakup of the Soviet Union has very little to do with the arms race. Nobody's talking about World War III.
Right, right. The worry is that there's these weapons out there that might get into the wrong hands.
Yes. Well, now that's the business of the Goldwater, senator from Georgia. What was his name? There was a separate agreement made in Congress by the Democratic conservative from Georgia, who's now resigned. I forgot exactly. But anyway, it was the Goldwater. Anyway, I forgot his name. It'll come back to me 2 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
But they have agreed that the United States would take these surplus weapons and burn them up. They bring them to they bring the plutonium to the United States to use as fuel. So the Soviet Union is exporting the garbage to the United States, and the United States is burning the garbage. And the Soviet Union began to burn. Ukraine got out of the business. So they took the Ukrainian bombs and started to burn them up. And Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan and Ukraine got out of the nuclear business. And the Soviet Union is using the fuel exported to the United States, and that's being consumed as fuel to run electric plants in the United States.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, there is a fear that the terrorists will pick up a loose nuke. Now, nobody knows what's happening in Egypt. Who shot down that plane and why? But Saddam Hussein was all bluff. He didn't have any weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
And George Bush 43 was fooling the United States by saying he was a threat. He was a threat to Israel. That's a real threat. But he wasn't a threat to the United States.
Right.
He didn't have any way to deliver these weapons. He didn't have any ICBMs.
Right.
He didn't even have a deployable missile to go to Britain.
No. No.
So that was all propaganda. Nevertheless, there are some people in the Republican Party who still fear the nuclear arms race.
Do you think that Putin...
Now, Putin is collapsed. The Soviet Union is collapsed.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union is half the size. Putin still has a nuclear plant running, and he's still making weapons.
Right.
But they're only at 8,000, and they are simply replenishing the old equipment. They're not expanding them. In other words, if you keep the weapons in the storage bin for 5 years, 10 years, they deteriorate. So they're making replacement parts.
New casings.
Yeah, but they're not expanding it any.
What do you think the hope is for nuclear disarmament?
You mean further disarmament?
Yeah. I mean making nuclear weapons a thing of the past.
Well, you get down to the problem of...
Can we put Pandora back in the box?
No, here's the problem now. We have India...
And
Pakistan and North Korea and Israel,
right,
who still haven't signed the Intermediate Non-Proliferation Treaty. Okay. So the Soviet Union and the United States do not want to build down any faster. They want to go down to 4,000.
Right.
Or 2,000.
Not without those signatures.
Without some signatures.
Yeah.
Now, the Chinese have limited to 300. The French have 250.
Right, and England has some.
Okay. They know that they can't destroy anything.
Yeah.
But the United States and China are having economic problems. The North Korea is a threat to Japan.
Right, because they can reach Japan. They can't reach the United States.
How does the United States, Japan, and the old Russia, how did they get the two Koreans to agree to a truce? Because North Korea is a basket case. They're starving to death. But China doesn't put any pressure on North Korea because they don't want the North Korean refugees in China. So those negotiations are in limbo. Now, the Koreans supposedly have 8 weapons. The ones that really are threatened are Japan,
Robert, we had 2 minutes.
Okay, well, we've been talking over time anyway, so we can close here on, I'm satisfied with this as a close. And as far as I'm concerned, the arms race is at a stalemate. I don't think the United States is going to build down. I don't think that Russia is going to build down any further. But we're waiting to see what happens in the Middle East. And the new conflicts are Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And I don't think that either Putin or Obama are very savvy of what's going on in the Middle East. And the United States has problems with Israel. That's the real negotiations. What are they going to do? What is Hillary Clinton going to do about Netanyahu? That's the real end.
What
as far
is
as
Hillary
I'm
going to
concerned,
do
that's the end of my
about
last comment.
Benjamin Netanyahu?
That's the future. Yeah.
I don't think that she'd want to do anything very big.
Well,
myself.
we'll have to stop
wait
at that
and
point.
see. Yeah.
We'll have to go to a new topic next time.
Thank you for having me, Professor. It's always
Thank
nice to see you.
I call this, the debate is the oxygen of democracy, and I wanted to keep the debate on how Ronald Reagan switched from a super hawk to a super dove and eliminated SDI as a threat.
It wasn't all bad.
Yeah, right.